Gene had long hair and a beard under his double chin. He was very overweight. He was wearing overalls and sandals and looked like something from the then-new country music TV show Hee Haw. He seemed completely thrown that someone besides John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and Gene Klein could write a song. I was annoyed that he saw himself as operating at a level that qualified him to pass judgment on me, as though all that mattered was his approval. The idea that he was judging me seemed arrogant, condescending, and ludicrous. He made it clear that he felt himself to be judging from a higher plane, and I didn't like that at all. Sure, Gene had grown up an only child, his mother telling him he was God's gift to the world, and Gene believing it. Gene could do no wrong, I could do no right. He showed up late to rehearsal a lot of the time and never apologized. It wasn't unusual for me to wait more than an hour beyond our scheduled meeting time at a Subway to go together to the rehearsal space. He was very much about himself. I threw pennies into the street in Chinatown because I knew he would run out and retrieve them. I used to just stand on the curb and fling them, and he would run into the gutter to get the coins. I already knew that Gene tried to screw everybody and anybody. It was part of how he defined himself, possessed by and obsessed with pussy. Gene sure used the word I a lot. Whenever I tried to answer questions about the band, I naturally answered using we. But when Gene answered similar questions, he always cast it as I. As an only child, Gene apparently didn't feel he had to answer to anybody or explain himself. He came off pretty goofy. Those false assumptions were based on Gene's own statements. Once again, I found myself scratching my head at his refusal to be honest and his insistence on using every opportunity to discuss things from his own perspective rather than the band's collective perspective. He was cheating. Though I never saw Gene as like-minded, I did see him as a partner. But to me it was clear that Gene continued to see the band as a vehicle for himself as an individual. Gene was in it for Gene. Whatever the reasons, he didn't share the collective mentality I had. It was funny because I always thought of Gene as the one member of the band I could count on, and yet he still did secretive things like that. It was that old impulse of his, and he never felt the need to explain any of what I saw as sneaky or dishonest behavior. Gene's wandering eye was clearly a potential risk to all we had accomplished and all we were working toward. Gene seemed fixated on Hollywood and spent as little time as possible on things related to the band. Gene, it turned out, had made a deal with a Hollywood producer. If the guy could send his kids and their friends to sing background vocals on a Kiss song, Gene would get some brownie points for some acting work out of the guy. Are you fucking kidding me? I was furious, and not just because Gene hadn't asked in advance for my okay. He was whoring us out and compromising our album for his own benefit. Gene had basically disappeared by that point, too. He left me with a pile of mostly unusable junk. Great. But despite his minimal involvement, Gene still wanted his name on the album as a co-producer. And naturally, he still expected a share of the money equal to mine. He was taking the band for granted, or worse, he was abusing what we had built together, and for what? A lot of things he was doing would prove a waste of time. I didn't understand his need to bask in whatever questionable spotlight he could find. I saw one of his movies and thought it was embarrassing. At the same time, Gene spent 24/7 putting himself in the spotlight and also chose to distort the public image of the band by increasing his perceived importance within Kiss, even as he was withdrawing from active involvement in it. Resentment started to simmer in me. Gene just didn't care. He would show up in the studio after being up all night with some third-rate band he was producing, exhausted, with some half-assed song he wanted to put on our album that he may or may not have actually written. Somebody wasn't playing for the team. Somebody was thinking only about himself. He also developed a new habit of using the Kiss logo and his Kiss makeup for personal projects without my approval, knowing full well it was needed. For Gene, sorry was a meaningless hall pass to placate me, until he would, of course, do the same thing again when he thought it would benefit him. As far as I was concerned, Gene's most successful venture in business was promoting the perception that he was a savvy businessman. That had been an undeniable success. Gene was about nonstop self-promotion. Gene would stagger into the studio after not sleeping all night. The few songs Gene brought in seemed to have been written by other people, with Gene pasting his name on after the fact. In his own way, he had betrayed me as much as Ace and Peter had. At this point, he was riding my coattails. Gene still hadn't contributed anything of quality to Crazy Nights. I don't think Gene cared about my solo tour at all.